We must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Are you a third-year physical therapy student that excels on tests when you have study guides, checklists, and deadlines? With all of the information available about how to prepare for the NPTE, it's easy to get disorganized and not feel prepared going into the big day. NPTE Prep Success is an online course that provides PT students easy-to-use study guides and step-by-step guidance through the NPTE preparation. To learn more, visit kylericeprep.com. Thank you again all for your continued support, and now for the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Wyrock, and I am joined by my fellow co-host, Brandon Poen. And today we have the esteemed pleasure of talking to one of my leadership mentors, Jim Hoyme. Jim co-owns and is the CEO of Therapy Partners, a MSO for independent therapy partners. He is also a partner in OSI Physical Therapy, a highly successful private practice in Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota. Jim received his bachelor's degree in biology and chemistry from Augustana College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and his PT degree from the University of Central Arkansas in Conway, Arkansas. He also received an MBA with a focus on organizational leadership from Bethel University in St. Paul. Jim has been very active in the American Physical Therapy Association and has served in various leadership roles in the Minnesota PT Association. He has also served on the Minnesota Department of Labor's Medical Services Review Board and MinHealth Clinical Guidelines Committee for Musculoskeletal Pain. He also teaches for the Leadership Edge program at 5 universities and has a number of therapy and to a number of therapy and medical practices. Jim, I am so excited that you're joining us on our podcast. And of course, thank you so much for all of your dedication and service to the profession. I'm obviously very familiar with you because you're one of my mentors and good friends, but for maybe those who aren't as familiar with you, could you just give our listeners some background about who you are and what's gotten you to where you are today?
All right. Well, Steph, thanks for inviting me. Brandon, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to be able to share some of my thoughts. I've been a physical therapist for over 35 years, but the last 15 have really focused on business management and leadership development in our two organizations, Therapy Partners and OSI Physical Therapy. And, maybe going way back, just to give you a little background, I grew up in a business family. My dad was a banker. He was an advisor to a number of small businesses and in the area. And so I've always had a keen interest in business, from listening to my dad talk and explain that. I also played team sports from the time I was really little, all through growing up through high school and then to college. And so teamwork has always been, top of mind for me. And while I was in high school, with basketball specifically, I was a pretty good basketball player. I had, and served some kind of well-recognized or traditional leadership roles while I was in high school, and specifically captain of a team, that had the statistics to prove it and accolades and so forth. And then I went on to college and I played basketball at Augustana as well. And things changed pretty significantly for me there. My leadership role was very different. I became a 20-20 player, as I like to call it. I got to play when we were 20 points ahead or 20 points behind. And, it's more of like a Division III talent at a Division II school, but it really opened my eyes to the importance of having leaders at all levels of an organization or team. And I never let go of that. And so I went on to physical therapy school, and I knew from the get-go I wanted to own a PT practice. So that was really my goal. That was my focus. I became a partner at OSI Physical Therapy in the St. Paul suburban area in the 1980s and really enjoyed the business of a private practice. And then we started Therapy Partners, MSO. And Therapy Partners is a management services organization, and we we bring independent physical therapy practices together. So we're under the name of Therapy Partners, and under our tax ID, we get contracts with insurance companies, the health insurance companies. But our member practices, which we have 17 now and 36 clinics and 130 providers and about 230 to 235 employees, they're independently owned. They all have different owners at the practice level, and they're seen in their communities as a small family-owned practice. But we're seen by the health plans as a large consolidated physical therapy group. So we bring the independent practices the best of both worlds. They get to own their business, but they're part of something bigger. And we get the strength of size. But my point with all this is, with all that we provide, when we do the contract, or we negotiate contracts with the health plans, and we're very comfortable with that. We provide revenue cycle management, billing, payment processing. We do practice management. We develop practice management software. So we help with the hard stuff, but we also work very diligently on clinical education, on leadership development, on team building, what I think would commonly be called the soft skills, or the soft things. And to be honest, what we see as our secret sauce, and what is seen as the secret sauce of physical therapy by even the health plans we work with, is teamwork. And it's teamwork that allows these independent practice owners, who probably by nature would see each other as competitors because they might have a clinic right down the street from one of the other members. They see themselves as allies. They see themselves as partners or friends. They're not competitors or enemies. And so to keep everybody together as a team, it really takes good leadership and a focus on leadership and teamwork. So we started Therapy Partners way back in 1999. So we're pushing our 20th year here in a few months. And probably about 3 years into it, I realized that I was really missing something. And I felt, gosh, if I'm gonna lead this organization with all these other practices involved, I've got to know more about the business. And so I went to a business school. I went to get my MBA, and I did it mainly for the reasons that most people do an MBA. The hard aspects of business: finance, economics, accounting, operations, human resources, etc. But my advisor encouraged me. He said, Jim, I think a good track for you to go is to go down the leadership track. And I thought, well, I don't know how I'd want to do that. I'm a good leader. I've been in leadership roles, and I've been in leadership positions. I think people see me as a leader. But at that time, I looked at, what was leadership to me, and it was kind of the typical, lead by example. You work hard, you lead with a vision, and you create strategy, you inspire and you care for people. And caring for people as a leader is really important. You engage in problem solving, you drive change, you make tough decisions, but ultimately you have to get results. And all that is very important for a leader. But what I came to realize about a month into my program, in the very first class we had, which was ethical leadership, the DNA of business. And so we were studying about ourselves, or studying about leading others. And I realized, I'm not a very good leader. I'm missing a lot of things that in my leadership role that I wasn't doing. And I thought, I've got to fill these gaps. So during the program, but then even afterwards, working with, really good mentors in our profession, Dr. Nancy Reese at University of Central Arkansas, a very strategic leader and a great role model, a great mentor. Kevin Halsey, that of course, very well, Steph. Mike Horsfield, Steve Anderson, any of a number of mentors that I've had. I started to realize I probably had 5 big gaps. And just to paraphrase those for you, as a leader, for your own leadership development and for helping others grow as leaders, that's really got to be part of who you are. It has to be part of your internal culture. And for me at the time, it wasn't. But I worked hard to make it part of who I was, that not only growing myself, but helping others grow as leaders. Secondly, I became more aware of a real distinction between leadership and management. And I think oftentimes people use those terms interchangeably, and they're not. They're two different things. Leading is about people. Managing is about process. So leading is inspiring people. Management, or managing, is about controlling and organizing processes. And when those come together, when those two circles come together and they overlap, that's when you get good results. That's when you can guide your team to achieving results. So that was a big thing that I was missing, but I feel like, I have a good handle on now that's really been important in my development. The importance of self-leadership as a precursor to leading others, having a good self-awareness, a social awareness, self-management, the ability to build relationships, to be proactive and engaged, to have self-confidence, to be that self-starter follower, to see yourself as a leader, even if you don't have a leadership title. Those types of things, that's what we mean by self-leadership. And once you can do that, now people are more likely to follow you, where you can be a very effective leader, making tough decisions, driving change, being a good coach, a mentor of others, living by maybe a more defined leadership approach in an organization. That's what we call leading others. But you have to lead yourself before you can lead others. Fourth, and Steph, I know you like this one. I learned from one of my mentors in business school that feelings are facts. And this guy was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, a Air Force guy, a tough guy. But he surprised me one day. He says, Jim, he said, until you recognize that how people feel is who they are, and respect that, and not ask the question of like, why do they feel that way, but to accept the fact that they do feel that way and work with them, it's really hard to lead. So feelings are facts. And then fifth, I would say no matter where you're at in your leadership career and in your leadership role, to grow, to learn, you have to be very intentional about it, and you have to make it a priority in your life. So that's probably, kind of a long way of getting there, but I think it's really shaped me in terms of putting leadership as a priority in what I do day in and day out.
Yeah. And Jim, I must say, I really respect kind of hearing your path between how it started off when you were younger, and then kind of seeing your family having that business background, and then going through sports, learning that team aspect, and then, ultimately pursuing your goal as a therapist, and then as a business owner, and then realizing, well, maybe I should do more leadership stuff. And then you kind of mentioning those 5 big lessons and realizing, wow, there's stuff more that I can learn. So, in his Sarasota lecture a few years ago, Dr. Chad Cook discussed the importance of selecting potential PT students based on leadership qualities rather than solely on academic qualities. And you have talked to and taught many PT students and clinicians about leadership throughout your career. So I'm curious, from your standpoint, what is your current view on our profession's leadership qualities, and how do student leadership qualities today compare to student leadership qualities 5 to 10 years ago?
Great question, Brandon. And I wish I had been there that day to hear Chad's lecture. I'd have been the first probably to run up on the stage and, give him a shout out and a hug and high five. And, when do we get started with this? Because I think he's spot on. I think that, you have to have a certain academic qualifications and academic acumen to handle the rigors of physical therapy school. And I think that's been proven over the years. But I do think there's more that needs to be included in the selection process, and to incorporate more leadership traits or skills or qualities, I think would be very important. So I'm going to start with maybe just putting it in a little bit of a context. So I've taught taught leadership classes in PT schools for about 12 years now. With first-year students, we get 2 programs. So for first-year students, it's really about self-leadership, culture, accountability, and so forth. For third-year students, we shift the focus a little bit to the healthcare market demands. How do you create value? How do you understand the business, and how do you deliver value not only to your employer but to the community at large, and as you enter and embark on your career? And then we also emphasize again the business side of things too. So I've had some experience and have been very interested in watching kind of how physical therapy students, particularly, but young physical therapists as well, how do they embrace this whole, leadership? Is it important? Is it not important? Do I see it, how it works in my career? But maybe starting with your second question, Brandon, looking at, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, as that compares to today, to the young physical therapist or the physical therapy student today. In some ways, I don't think it's changed too much. So I'll try to use something that's a little bit objective here in terms of how I come to some conclusions. So our program that we've developed, we've got about I guess just over 2,000 students who've taken the StrengthsFinder assessment, and so we've done that from the very beginning. And when I look back 10 years ago, and I don't know if you've done StrengthsFinders or not, but it's, there's 34 strengths organized into 4 basic domains of strength, and they're of relationship building strengths, influencing strengths, strategic thinking strengths, and executing strengths of getting things done. So the relationship building, those strengths are really geared towards, people with those strengths are good at connecting with people. People with executing strengths, they have a proclivity to get things done fast. And then the strategic thinkers, they're the, see over the top of the mountain and figure out a way to get around it. They're like the free safety on a football team, anticipating. And then there's the influencing strengths that probably are a little more geared. They're probably a little more hardwired to lead, to sell big ideas. So we've been doing this for years. And, 10 years ago, I looked at our data, from 2000 classes of 2008 to 2012, the top 10 strengths in those classes, there was 5 relationship building strengths, 4 executing strengths, and 1 strategic thinking strength. Compared that to the classes from 2017 to 2021, and hasn't changed a lot. There's still 5 relationship, 4 executing, and 1 strategic thinking strength. But what I've seen is that the strategic thinking strength, which is learner, that's in the top 10, and the 4 executing strength have moved up a little bit. So starting to see a little move. Just again, for those of you who are into StrengthsFinders, relationship strengths, the top ones are harmony, relator, empathy, developer, and positivity. Executing strengths are achiever, which a lot of that's the number 1 strength for physical therapy students, by the way. Responsibility, restorative means you like to fix things. Consistency and discipline. And the consistency was in the top 10 years ago, and discipline is now, but they're very similar strengths. And then the strategic thinking strength, as I mentioned, was learner. So not a lot of influencing strengths. In fact, influencing strengths like command and competition and significance, self-assurance, activator, they don't even appear till number 17. So like halfway through StrengthsFinder for a physical therapy student. So, and then when I look at the bottom 5 strengths that you typically see with physical therapy students, influencing strengths are in the bottom 5. Command, significance, self-assurance, and activator. So interestingly, hasn't changed a lot.
And just to kind of interrupt and maybe give our listeners a little bit of context. For those of you that aren't familiar with StrengthsFinders, this is a very objective measure that was developed by Gallup, and it has a ton of data behind it. I think their sample sizes that they've done the research on is over 2 million. So, it's got a lot. Yeah, it's got a ton of data behind it. If you are ever interested in doing your StrengthsFinders for our listeners, you can just buy the book, and it gives you a code that you can go online and take it. It takes about 45 minutes. And I think the book is only $10. It's not that much. So I wanted to throw that in there in case people were wondering what StrengthsFinders, where it comes from.
Yeah. Good point, Steph. And in fact, you can take it online too. If you just Google take StrengthsFinder or take StrengthsFinder's assessment, it's $19. You're going to get your top 5 and a nice little report. If you want to get all 34 of them, it's like $45, but I don't think that's necessary.
What are your top 5 strengths, Jim?
Mine are futuristic, strategic, achiever, and all of them are fairly, kind of can determine what they mean just by the name. So futuristic, strategic, achiever, maximizer. Maximizers like to go from good to great. Always like to see things improve, and learner.
Sounds like you have a lot of influencing strengths in yours.
Executing, and influencing are probably my biggies.
So I've taken StrengthsFinders as well, and my top 5 are futuristic, like yours, Jim, input, woo, communication, and learner. So definitely, if you guys
Not surprising, Steph.
If you guys really want to learn about yourself, and when you do the StrengthsFinders assessment, it gives you ways that you can pair up with people who maybe have strengths where you maybe don't, and really you can learn how to tailor your teamwork and really enhance the strengths that you have. Sorry to interrupt your explanation of that. Throw that in there so that people weren't confused.
No, that's good points, and I'm glad you did, Steph, so don't apologize. Now, having said all that, Brandon, to your point, I do think physical therapy students and young physical therapists are doing better in terms of leadership and business learning, and I think so for two reasons. One, what I'm seeing in students over the last 5 years is a greater interest in learning how to become a better leader, and also having an interest or a curiosity about, how does the business of physical therapy even work? So interestingly, for you millennials, who I have a great respect for, and I think a lot of you guys, you got a bad rap for whatever reasons by some of the, the Gen Xers and the baby boomers. But I'm a big millennial fan, both for the two kids I have who are millennials, and but also just because some of the absolute best young leaders I've seen, not only in physical therapy school, but across therapy partners and other practices around the country, just fantastic leaders. So Pew Research has found that 91% of millennials want to have opportunities to learn how to become a better leader. 91%. But the bad news is 63% of millennials feel that they do not get adequate opportunities to learn how to be a better leader, either in school or in their work. 63%, yet 91% want that opportunity. But what I found is really fascinating and really encouraging for our future leaders, the next generation of leaders, is the main reason that millennials want to lead is they want to empower those around them to learn and grow. I mean, that is a classic example of transformational leadership, of servant leadership. And so in that respect, much greater interest in learning how to lead. And then secondly, a much higher engagement. I remember back in the days, and maybe it's just delivery style or maybe it's just better content, but back in the day, for the first 5 or 6 years doing this class, maybe 10% of the class would really be into it. They'd ask questions at breaks. They'd stick around after class and ask questions. They'd email afterwards. Now, when we get done with the class, during the breaks, students are always coming up, well, what do you think of this? Or how would I lead in this situation? Or gosh, can I really be a leader when I'm just a first-year student? They're asking questions afterwards. They're coming up and shaking hands and saying, thank you very much. Gosh, I never even thought of this as being an important part of my career, and it makes me more excited about it. So I think interest and engagement are definitely going up, Brandon, so that is the good news. So I would just say that maybe 4 needs within physical therapy school to make it even better. I think that physical therapy schools, much like Chad Cook talked about, maybe look at maybe a broader distribution of, or a broader diversity of strengths, and try to get a little bit more on the influencing. I think they need to create more opportunities for DPT students to learn to be leaders while in physical therapy school, not even to do like you two have done. You guys are really high-end leaders, where you're at in your career, but even just leading in small ways, helping a student, being a mentor, being a proctor in a class, those types of things. I think that that leadership development needs to become part of the culture of physical therapy education. And that I don't think physical therapy students need to be like an MBA student or run a co-track in physical therapy and business, but they at least have to have an awareness of the business needs of physical therapy.
Good. And Jim, something that I know we've kind of been looking at recently is we actually recently had Janet Besner on the show to kind of talk about ACAP's Leadership Academy and kind of an overall approach from an organizational standpoint to kind of implement more leadership awareness and opportunities, like you had kind of said, and even just find out what the status is of leadership across the country when it comes to PT programs. So with all the stuff that's been going on organization-wise to enhance leadership throughout DPT programs, what do you feel like is the barriers behind leadership implementation within the programs?
Yeah, time, first and foremost, time. The programs are packed with curriculum, certain defined topics and curricula they have to cover. So how do you squeeze leadership into this thing, when you already have a full schedule? So I think that's a big barrier. I think another barrier is just the lead. You mentioned Janet Besner, a fantastic leader, who's part of a fantastic program at Texas State University, that's led by Dr. Barb Sanders as their chair. So you've got Janet, you've got Barb, you've got another faculty member, there's Debbie Baylor, who really, they embrace the importance of leadership. So you need that at the top, and you don't have that in all the PT schools. So time, leadership at the top. And then I think the other one is, whereas you might have the leadership at the top that advocates it, you really need to make sure that all faculty is on board, so it has to become part of the culture. And it has to be very intentional as well. And time spent getting, think about it. Let's say you've got a faculty member who's got a PhD in neuroscience, or a PhD in, some aspect of psychology. Well, that's what they're going to be focusing on. Now you start throwing some of this other stuff in there and going, wait a minute, that's not really what's important here. But I think incorporating into the learning experience is critical.
I love how you highlight the culture aspect of it, Jim. I think that that's something that, in order to have anything be successfully implemented, no matter whether you're talking about in a PT program or in a business, that has to be a priority. Otherwise, people aren't going to want to implement that. Healthcare in general just continues to change. And so a lot of times businesses or PT schools or hospitals don't really even know what's going to happen next year.
Yeah.
How should PT programs and their faculty respond to and prepare students for these known and unknown changes in healthcare?
Well, I think, Steph, starting with teaching, what's going on in the marketplace there? What are the market realities? So what's going on with healthcare reform? I think, it is complex. You look at the Affordable Care Act, you've got however many pages, a couple thousand pages of that, and it's gone through some different iterations and is still being debated. But, try to keep it simple, because you're not going to, teach your students, that whole law, or even all the peripheral things that are happening in the commercial side kind of related to the Affordable Care Act. But I would say teach students, we're going through 3 phases of healthcare. And one we're just about through. There's policy change. That's what we've spent the last 8 or 9 years debating and implementing. Now we're heavily into payment reform. So you've got policy change. Now we've got payment change. They're changing payment methodologies. They're expecting providers to take more risk. There's downward pressure on payment. That affects all of us. And PT students need to know that going into it and start thinking about, gosh, how could I innovate to make a difference here? And then I think the third phase that we're going to go through is care model change. And I think that's what physical therapy students, young physical therapists, really need to embrace, is that there's all this change going on out there. And part of it involves, pushing downward on how much we're going to get paid. How do we create care models that result in good outcomes with our patients, but don't cost quite as much? So I think teaching those 3 things are related to the changing healthcare stuff. I would say also teaching the big picture. How do physical therapists fit into this? Okay, we got all this stuff going on out there, but what's my role as a physical therapist in the healthcare delivery system? It's not just me evaluating, treating a patient at 8 o'clock and then going on to my 8:30 patient and then my 9 o'clock patient, but what kind of a difference am I making? So I think faculty can incorporate those types of things into classes. You don't have to have an entire semester class on healthcare reform or how do I fit into the big picture, but you can make it part of the learning experience. So you might say, hey, Brandon, if I'm a faculty and we're teaching a class on whatever, and I might say, hey, Steph, Brandon, what do you guys think? We're talking about this, this a certain aspect of orthopedic evaluation. How do you think that's going to work? When we're talking about bundled payments, with for a total knee replacement, how are you going to make that work in a PT clinic? You got to start thinking about those types of things and not just, measuring range of motion and, strength and the various things that go along with that. So I think that incorporating these changes and how physical therapists fit into that has to be part of PT education. But I think also kind of along with that, to help physical therapy students understand, you got to, part of being a good physical therapist is being flexible. Part of being a good student is being flexible, being adaptable. I look at leadership as, John Maxwell talks about leadership as influence. I think it's adaptable influence. You have to be able to adapt. You have to be able to influence people. You have to be able to influence yourself, but you have to have that flexibility with it, because knowing things are going to change and you're going to have to go about things a little bit differently.
Yeah, and I just want to add like a comment to that, Jim, in the sense that, you talk about how we should be implementing this in our classrooms and having faculty teach it. But I would also say that for clinical education, clinical instructors need to be reinforcing these concepts. I didn't get any introduction really into payment or the big picture of things until I went into my final private practice rotation, and my clinical instructor sat down with me and explained like what insurance was, how we get paid, what happens if you don't document correctly. I mean, a lot of my clinical instructors told me, well, if you don't document this, you could lose your license, but they never, or if I asked them, well, how do we know how much the patient is paying? They would just be like, well, I don't know. I just do my billing and write my notes. So I think that that's also something that we need to also put on clinical instructors, is having them understand how we're getting paid. What does insurance do? What is that big picture, in order to really make that clinical picture even more clear for students when they're in the real world clinical setting.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Now think about that challenge. I mean, not only do you have the challenge, okay, now let's say you're a visionary leader of a chairperson, and you're working with the visionary dean of the school, and you're putting a big emphasis on leadership and business development. Now you got to get your faculty on board with it. You got to be able to figure out, how am I going to squeeze it into the education? Now you got to connect with all those CIs out there and say, hey, you guys, when our students come out there, give them a little introduction to proper coding and what happens if you don't, those types of things. But big challenge, but it has to happen. Maybe if I could, Brandon, I didn't address one of your questions. Back to I think you asked, what's my current view of, leadership in our profession. And I think it relates to a lot of what you just offered, Steph, as well. So I think we've got some great leaders in our profession. I mean, think about it. Sharon Dunn, fantastic leader. And I mentioned Mike Horsfield, Steve Anderson a little bit earlier, great leaders. Nancy Reese, Barb Sanders, Jim Gordon, in faculty education at a high leadership level. Yogi Matharu and Robin Howard come to mind at University of Southern California, Bill McGehee, Meryl Lapadu at University of Florida, Janet Besner, who you mentioned, Brandon. So I think we've got some great leaders. But as a whole, I think we lack leadership, both at a high level and just kind of through the rank and file of physical therapists. And I think when you look at leadership, you got to make it simple. It can be a complex topic, but if you keep it as simple as possible, leadership is influence, or leadership is adaptable influence. And so what does influence mean? Your ability to positively affect how people think, how they act, how they feel, their mindset, how they contribute, how they get engaged, how they get results in your organization. To do that without coercing them, without forcing them, to do it without commanding them. You do it in a way they believe in you. I see that in you, Steph, because I know you well from, people believe in you and they want to follow you, not because you're pulling the wool over their eyes, but they want to go because they believe in what you believe in. And I don't think we have a lot of that in our physical therapy profession. I'll tell you 3 reasons why. I think first, you start at the high level. Our influence, our ability to influence powerful decision makers, the people at health plans, at United Healthcare, at Blue Cross Blue Shield, at Anthem. And we haven't really sold and influenced them well enough to sell our value. And that's why payment is down. Payments for physical therapists should be much higher, but we've not done a good job there. I think secondly, with the rank and file, one-on-one with patients, I would say most physical therapists don't do a good job of positively influencing their patients. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, because we do a lot of wonderful things. But I just saw that WebPT did a study a few months back, and they found that only 10% of patients complete their plan of care with physical therapists. It's 1 out of 10. So something has happened where the physical therapist has not inspired that patient to put coming to those last 2 or 3 appointments to finishing their plan is important in their life. And then I think in communities, we haven't done a good job of influencing in communities. How about this statistic from Optum Health and then I forget where the other one is from. I don't know if it was from Price Waterhouse, my PwC, but Optum found that only 7% of people with musculoskeletal pain see a physical therapist. 7%. And I've seen it as high as 10%, but not higher than that. We have not influenced people to have physical therapy be their number one choice for musculoskeletal pain. So I think, the state of affairs, Brandon, is such that we've got a lot of work to do, but, I think, why does that happen? I think if you look at what does a good leader do, they see the big picture. And I think most physical therapists are so focused on their patient care with one patient after another, which you need to do. But, I think you need to take a look at the big picture. Good leaders are proactive. And this is what really makes me sad. I think most physical therapists are not real self-confident. To be proactive, you have to have confidence in your decision-making and be willing to take a risk and be willing to fail. And I think that needs to start in physical therapy school. I'll give you an example. I asked a PT class. I won't say which PT school it was, but it was 3 years ago. And it was just after the class, just kind of wrapping things up. I said, all right, you're going off on your internships. How many of you are really confident going into it? Not one hand went up. Out of 50 students, not one hand really confident. I said, oh, all right. So how many of you are confident? A couple students sheepishly raised their hand. Well, okay. How many of you aren't confident? And more than half the class kind of just raised their hand up. I said, why? And most of the comments were, well, I'm afraid I'll make a mistake. I'm afraid somebody will think I'm stupid. I'm afraid my CI won't like me. It's like, that tells me self-confidence wasn't instilled in them. So I think that's a big problem. Leaders are passionate about what they bring as value. And I think physical therapists haven't developed sales skills and negotiating skills and that ability to sell their value to a patient. So when a patient says, oh my gosh, Jim, I've got a $30 copay and you're asking me to come 10 times, that's $300. I said, yeah, that's a lot of money. But you told me you want to be able to run again. Your knee's bothering you. Would you pay $300 to be able to run again? As opposed to saying, oh my gosh, $30, okay, let's just see you 5 times. That way it'll only be $150, and we tend to dumb it down. So I think that's a problem with physical therapy, leadership. Good leaders are innovators. I think physical therapists generally are pretty good at innovating with their patients and in clinical programs. We're not good for the kind of things I do, which is working with health plans, creating innovations. I asked a big health plan the other day, one of the top 3 in the country, and I threw a proposal out to them for a value-based payment model for physical therapy where you get paid based on the outcomes. I said, we're willing to take some financial risk with you. He said, you know what, Jim? No physical therapist has ever asked me that. My God, we've been talking about innovation in healthcare for the last 8 years with healthcare reform. And not one physical therapist has asked this guy to do a value-based program. I think that's the problem. And then last but not least, good leaders are collaborators. And I think that although you wouldn't expect this, I think this is counter to intuition about PTs, given who we are and what's in our hearts. But I think most, at least the ones in my world, Steph, and you see a lot of them. I think a lot of private practice physical therapists are not very good team players. They're not collaborators. They're very autonomous. They think they're the best at everything. And they're missing an opportunity to work collaboratively with others to do really cool things. So long answer to your question, but I think as a professional, whether it's in physical therapy school or in physical therapy practice, we need more influential leaders.
I couldn't agree more. And I think a lot of the points and data you have brought up is actually really quite shocking when you really consider it all. And when you really take a deep look at what we are doing across and really seeing there's definitely some ways that we can all improve. And, now that we've kind of mentioned kind of the scope of this and kind of some of the leadership qualities with that, let's go a little bit specifically on one of the avenues for a potential solution for this. So with the Leadership Edge program. So like you kind of mentioned earlier, you teach leadership content through multiple PT programs, including USC, University of Central Arkansas, University of Montana. So, to kind of get into more of a solution aspect, to kind of see how you kind of address this specifically within programs and clinics, would you mind telling us a little bit more about the Leadership Edge program?
Sure. Well, it's evolved a lot over the years, Brandon, but here's where we're at now, and I think it's pretty good. Obviously, as a maximizer, I always want to make it better, and things could be done better, and I wouldn't necessarily call it the Holy Grail, but we have 2 programs, Brandon, for physical therapy students, one for first-year students and one for third year. And the one for first year students is really about self-leadership. It's about preparing the first year student to have a good learning experience, especially over the next 4 years. And you guys have been, PT school wasn't that long ago for you. And you remember the stresses that come up and how tough it is. And so the program for first year students has 4 components. The first is about culture, and the students work together. They define their culture words. But first we talk about what's the difference between a group and a team. So we just kind of get that out on the table. And then we talk about, how do you build a team culture? And what we talk about examples of what's a bad culture that you experienced, maybe on a basketball team or an orchestra, or maybe as a work experience. And then we contrast that to examples that students have had with a good culture. And we talk about, okay, why did bad happen rather than good? When, culture is kind of a freebie, you don't have to buy a culture machine or anything like that. It's kind of, and so we talk about that, but then we talk about, or the students talk about, what are the 5 words that they wanted to describe the culture of their class for the next 3 years, and have a lot of fun with that. That's about an hour-long process. You take all these, they break up into small teams, and each team comes up with 5 words, and then they debate and discuss, and they ultimately agree on 5 words that describe their culture. Then they have to say, okay, since culture is behavior, how are we, if one of their culture words is tribe, for example, how are we going to behave as a tribe? And then they have to say, well, I am going to help one of my classmates. If they're struggling in a class, I will help them because we're part of the tribe, blah, blah, blah. So they talk about how they're going to live their culture. Then they create 1 to 3 rules of engagement. In other words, what are the rules I'm going to follow on how I'm going to treat my classmates and how I'm going to treat the faculty members? Like one might be, I will never talk behind someone's back, and they agree to them. And then they come up with words of accountability. So maybe it's pineapple, so Steph might, we might be having lunch one day, and maybe Steph says, oh man, can you believe Dr. So-and-so? Now she's got us doing this or that. And now goes against our, one of our rules of engagement, that we were not going to talk behind anybody's back. So I might not want to make a big deal about it with Steph. So I just might say pineapple, and so what we do is we try to get the students to hold each other accountable to create a good culture. So it's culture. We do followership, which is a phenomenal aspect of leadership, and the kind of a lead into leadership. And followership has 2 determinants. It's on the x-axis, it's a disengaged person or student to engaged on the other extreme. And then you've got contribution, the more passive contributor to the more proactive contributor. And so with the followership, and I won't go into great detail on that, we go through the positive, there's 4 quadrants. There's the self-starter, who's engaged and proactive and self-confident. Then there's the doer, who's engaged, maybe lacks a little confidence, and but probably just needs to be, get a few more pats on the back, have a few more wins under their belt, get built up a little bit more by the faculty members and their colleagues or their classmates, and then they become a little bit more self-confident too, and they grow. Then on the negative side, the people who are disengaged with their classes and but maybe proactive, but in a negative sense, and being critical of what's going on and tend to bring people down, we call those that criticizer behavior. And then the bottom quadrant, where people are disengaged, they're not contributing, they kind of do as little as possible, call those the shirkers. So we talk about that, and where do you land, and how does a shirker or a criticizer impact the class versus how does a doer or a self-starter impact the class? So we do that, then we do Strengths Finder, and then we end up with how do you lead as a student. So that's for the first year students. For third year students, we take a little different track. So the first year students is about self-leadership and creating a good culture. The third year students, it's about bigger picture leadership. Okay, now I'm getting ready to go into my internships. And then from there, I'm going to step into my career. And we want to get people ready for that. So we have 4 components there. We talk about the changing healthcare market, like I did here a few minutes ago. Big picture, but how do you fit into that? We talk about how do you lead as a student? What are different ways you can lead? Little things. Be on time. Don't be distracted. Be present. Listen. Help your colleagues out. Show every patient you care. Take on a few extra responsibilities that might be available to you, those types of things. But then we have a lot of group discussions, and I'll throw questions out there. Okay, what are you going to do if this happens in an internship? And so then they talk about that. We talk about the business of physical therapy, kind of from a high level, and we talk about coding. What happens if you've provided 3 codes, but then you'd say, well, I don't know, this code's kind of like this one. What happens if I don't charge for that? And what if you do that, say 300 times during the course of your internship, or once you get out in your career? What if you do that 1,500 times a year, not code for something? How does that impact your practice? But also, Steph, as you know, from your knowledge of being able to negotiate a good compensation package, it impacts you, So we talk about all these little things that you can do that not only have either a positive, or if you don't do them, a negative impact on the practice, but how does that come back to either help or hurt you? So we talk about that. And then we spend probably our most amount of our time, and I would highly recommend this TED Talk. And Steph, I think you've watched it, but it's by Casey Brown, Cascy. Casey Brown. She's a single mom, entrepreneur, has her own business, and her TED Talk is Know Your Worth and Sell It, I believe is what it's called. But it talks in there about how do we talk about how do you know the value that you bring to your patients, and how do you sell that to a patient? So even if they push back a little bit, how do you sell that value so that they do complete their plan of care? But also, how do you sell your value to your employer? And how do you know how much to ask for, say it's on your first job or any job thereafter? And as you know, Steph, there's a little formula you can follow. And I think it works. I don't know, what would be your reaction to that, Steph? Because I know you've shared some thoughts.
Yeah, I think that all that is very valid. And I think that that's really important, because one of the things that I've heard from many young graduates, and I remember thinking this when I came out of school too, is you hear all these physical therapists, or even from some professors or people that you admire, that you're a new grad, so you're going to get paid $55,000, $60,000. Though, a lot of students are coming out with debt and they have to pay off their loans. And sometimes students will ask, or new professionals will ask, for a larger sum of money. And I think that understanding why you would deserve that larger sum of money when you don't have experience, you have to be very confident in yourself, yet you have to have data to back up why this employer should pay you more money. Mm-hmm. When they already have physical therapists that have 10 years of experience, they make them a lot of money. They, are going through Con Ed courses, and you are just coming out of school. So you don't really have a lot of data. So I think that all those points are very, very valid. And it's a lot easier to negotiate your salary when you have that data. I really like what you said about how, coming out as a third-year student, understanding what your worth is and selling it, and what you need to do to lead as a student intern. And you kind of covered some of the points that you cover in the Leadership Edge program. But I think a lot of students in PT programs struggle with the balance of learning the essential theory and knowledge needed to becoming a safe and effective PT, and then supplementing that curriculum with lessons on soft skills like leadership, communication, understanding the business of healthcare. And, we've kind of covered some of those barriers. But how has your program, the Leadership Edge, really addressed this? And what advice would you give to program directors who want to implement this leadership development, like some type of leadership development, into their curriculum without sacrificing the CAPTE required content?
Great question, Steph. I think, first of all, you're right. It is a challenge, because now you got to work it into an already busy schedule. But the reality is you got to do it some way. And I think, having been on the bad side of this, the first few years we did this Leadership Edge program, it was really bad because it was a little too esoteric. It was a little kind of high level. It was kind of PhD-ish, leadership theory and all that. You've got to make it very practical. So especially, let's take the front end with a first-year student. A leadership program, a first-year student has to hear that and think about it and say, how can I do this? And how will it affect me? Will it make studying easier? Will it make it easier for me to learn the material? Will it make it more fun to hang out with my classmates? Will it prevent us from creating, cliquey behavior? So no matter what they do, it has to be very practical and very meaningful to the students. So I think from a student standpoint, two things. One, is this something I can do that's not that hard? It just requires me to be a good person and be, intentional about getting it done. So it's going to make the learning experience better. But it's also going to help me be a better physical therapist. It's going to prepare me to be a good physical therapist. So you also have to make the point that not only will you do this while you're here as a student, when you become a physical therapist, you're going to get a better job. You're going to be viewed higher. You're going to be seen as someone who's a good leader and a good team player. And so it's going to help you on a broad perspective, but keep it simple.
Yeah, I think those are some really powerful points, Jim. And especially, so I know you'd mentioned quite a bit of tidbits of advice on kind of my next question here, a little bit more specifically. But let's say, for example, that a new professional or even a seasoned therapist may be experiencing kind of the phenomenon of burnout.
Yeah.
So how would you recommend guiding that person to begin their leadership journey to kind of get out of it and kind of get on their right path forward to really make an impact to what they want to do?
Yeah, very, very relevant, Brandon. So kind of like with students, you've got to make it practical and you've got to make it simple. So maybe I'll start with a little story. We have a physical therapist at OSI Physical Therapy, a part of Therapy Partners, and young guy, he's been out 3 years now. Really a good leader. But when he started, and I invited him to participate in our leadership development program a week after he started, he sent me an email and he goes, Jim, did you really mean to invite me? He said, I'm a staff therapist. I've only been here a week. You want me to become a leader? Go through a leadership program? I said, I do, because we do this for all the, so he came and he said, well, I'm not really sure why I'm doing this, but I'm here. When all was said and done, he got done. He said, you know what, Jim? After going through that, I have more confidence. Every time I walk into a room, I have more confidence, and I have more confidence when I'm telling him on the evaluations that I'm doing and how I'm managing the case. So he said, now that I see myself as a leader, I've become a better physical therapist. So I think the challenge of as we call them, the big L leader of an organization or a leader manager in an organization, and you're trying to develop the young physical therapists that are there, or the staff therapist, or a front desk person, or a back office person, is you've got to make this a practical application so that when people see themselves as growing their self-leadership skills, they see themselves as becoming a better person. They see themselves as being better able to connect with patients and their coworkers, to where, that they don't go into us thinking, my God, I don't want to be a CEO, or I don't want to be a clinic manager. I just want to be a good physical therapist. And you say, well, you know what? When you become a better leader, you become a better physical therapist.
I love that, Jim. I think that is such an amazing saying. You had mentioned earlier in our discussion about how, you were leading this company. You didn't feel like you were really kind of at the leadership level that you wanted to be at, or you started realizing when you were going through your MBA course. And I think that it's so admirable that you I obviously know you now as an adult, but I'm assuming that you were still relatively influential, when you were starting to learn all this stuff, but that you kind of realized that these were the improvements that you needed to make, and you were already leading a ton of people towards a common goal. So how would you recommend that people who are already in leadership positions, for example, PT program directors, PT faculty, private practice owners, or, physical therapy department managers, how would you recommend that they continue along their leadership journey? And then do you have any recommendations to them for helping them foster young leaders like their PT students or their younger colleagues?
I have to tell you, I am impressed with your questions. So that is a great one, Steph, and kind of in a long list of really good questions from you guys. But I would say, first and foremost, if you're a leader, and let's say you're a practice owner or a faculty or a program chair, director of a clinic or a department in a hospital, whatever it might be, but you've got a solid leadership position, but you want to become a better leader. First and foremost, you have to have that mindset of, I want to get better. And that leadership is a journey. Like I discovered, I thought I was a good leader back in the day, and the reality was, no, I wasn't. So I learned a better way to do it. But every day, I go home at the end of every day and think, God, why did I do that? why did I should not have said it that way, or I probably could have made a better decision on this. So I have to self-reflect on it and say, you know what, leadership's a journey. I'm going to keep getting better. I want to keep learning. So I think that would be one thing. And so since it is a journey, I think self-reflection is a big thing, to be able to kind of shut the noise off. Maybe you just turn the radio off on the way home, or once you get home, you sit back in a chair, maybe you have a beer, shut your eyes, but self-reflect, what did I do today? What were the good things I did? And what were the things that maybe I could have done a little bit better? So I think self-reflection is big on your journey. But also to never lose sight of that part of why I'm here as a leader is to help others learn and grow, because, so Brandon and Steph, if when you get to be, 10 years down the road, or shoot, even now I look at it, and to look at young leaders like you, and for someone like me who's been around a long time, to say, you know what, they are so far ahead of me that I was when I was their age, or they're going to be such better leaders than I'm, because of maybe some little influence I may have had, or a friend of mine may have had. That is so gratifying. And I think as a big L leader, if you decide, I want to make the next generation way better, or help the next generation be way better than ours, I think along those lines of having a growth mindset. I don't know if you guys have ever read the book or seen the book by Carol Dweck, Growth Mindset. Carol Dweck's a PhD psychologist from Stanford, and she says there's two kinds of people. There's those that have a growth mindset. They're not afraid of failure. They want to learn and grow. They learn as much from their failures as they do from their mistakes. Learning the material is more important than getting a 4.0. Then you've got the fixed mindset. They're just the opposite. 4.0 is better than learning because I will want to look good. I don't want to be wrong because somebody might think I'm stupid. I don't want to go into this internship and have my CI think I don't know everything. And I think a great leader has a growth mindset, and you always want to learn. You always want to learn. I want to learn from you, Steph. I want to learn from you, Brandon. I'm learning as much from, interacting with you guys today as you are from me. I think that a great leader who wants to get even better always works to have a good leadership culture, a great leadership culture, whether, culture eats strategy for breakfast, whether it's in a PT school or whether it's in your PT practice. Becoming a better listener, another great TED Talk, one of my favorites. I try to listen to it every couple of weeks, is Celeste Headlee, Headlee, 10 Ways to Have a Better Conversation. Awesome TED Talk. And, she gives a lot of little tips and advice on how do you stay in there? How do you stay in that conversation, stay connected and not get distracted and not try to take it over? But very important, whether you're dealing with a patient or a colleague or your spouse or soon-to-be spouse, Brandon. And then I think third would be to just really be intentional. And I think I've used the word intentional about 100 times this evening. But, if you're going to do it, do it. If you're going to do it, make a commitment to do it. Don't just say, well, I should do this, or I should get better at this. Damn it. If you're going to do it, do it. So I would say that for the experienced leader, but you're always going to get better.
Oh, absolutely. And Jim, it's been amazing to really kind of hear all these tidbits and kind of learn all these different avenues of leadership and all the aspects that it takes, because frankly, it's not something that I kind of really had learned early on until actually hitting a little bit of struggle and then realizing that, I have to change things to get over that a little bit. So hearing the points that you've made, I think is very powerful, because I agree that confidence that you feel when you're in school and your clinicals is a very big predictor of what you'll be when you get out into the real world. And if that's on the wrong foot, or that's the wrong, maybe not optimal way that it should be, it definitely can make a recipe for problems. This has been a very, very powerful chat to really talk about some things. But, Jim, we like to kind of ask this question at the end of every episode, because of course we're called the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. Now, if this has something to do with leadership or something even totally different, feel free. But the question is, if you could change one aspect of healthcare education, whether that be DPT or otherwise, which aspect would you change, and how would you change it?
Well, you know what, Brandon, I think I'm going to go just maybe a little bit different direction, because I've kind of made my point on, making leadership development part of curriculum. I think there's a move afoot to do that. So I think we're on some track there. I think I would be tempted to say make leadership part of your culture and leadership, and I think you have to do that. But we talked a little bit about that. Make incorporate, you don't necessarily need 5 leadership classes or a leadership class every semester, but if a faculty member can create a leadership culture by just asking questions, maybe it's maybe you're an advisor and ask your advisee, I want you to answer these 10 questions for me, or bring these answers with you tomorrow when we have our meeting. How did you use your strengths this semester? How did you help one of your classmates who needed help this semester? How did you show self-confidence when you really weren't confident? 10 questions like that. Now you make it part of your culture. But I think if there's one thing that would really help just to go a little different direction, it's in physical therapy education or healthcare education as a whole. Don't make it so siloed. Get physical therapists interacting with med students, get physical therapists interacting with OTs and psych students and whatnot, and have them work together and from the very get-go create collaborative learning experiences rather than siloed learning experiences, because then it's going to be more your nature going out into the real world to be a collaborator rather than an isolator. So that would be my recommendation if I had any influence in that respect.
I like that, Jim, because I know that, when we ask that question at the end of each episode, number one is usually cost. The most common answer is normally cost. And number two, I would say, is definitely number two is a more updated curriculum. And number three, I would say, is like your answer was kind of more interprofessional integration of that within education. So that's a very, very common answer. And I like how there's been more discussions that brainstorm how that can happen for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Jim, I think that you've probably piqued a lot of people's curiosity with all this talk on leadership. So I'm sure that people are going to want to reach out to you. If they want to reach out to you online with a question, where can they find you?
Well, you can either contact me via email at Hoyme, JHOYME @therapypartners.com, or on Twitter at Hoyme TPI, HOYME, capital TPI for Therapy Partners. So that's a little more personal stuff. And then we also, Therapy Partners has a Twitter account at Therapy Partners. There I talk more about, and Craig Johnson, who you know well, we throw things out there related more to the business of physical therapy and healthcare policy and how do you negotiate a contract with an insurance company and all that kind of stuff. And then we also have one more that's more leadership, teamwork, professional development oriented, and it's called at Engage, capital G, AGE PT, Engage PT. So I'm on LinkedIn, both Jim Hoyme account and also a Therapy Partners account there. So
we'll have all that in the show notes for you guys if you want to look Jim up and give him a contact. Actually, I think, Jim, how we met was on Twitter, was how we made this interaction, and then made a connection with our Minnesota roots and have been friends ever since. So definitely give Jim a shout out on Twitter. He will totally respond to you. Well, thank you guys. Thank you, Jim, so much for joining us today. And thank you to our listeners for listening in on our great conversation. This has been really enriching. And next time, we'll catch you then. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Brandon.
Access to healthcare is one of the largest issues facing both providers and patients, as millions of people worldwide lack timely and affordable access to healthcare. Anywhere Healthcare, a telehealth platform, is a simple, low-cost option for providers and patients that eliminates the barriers to access to all kinds of healthcare. To find out more, check out anywhere.healthcare, which is available on our show notes. And if you use the code HET in all caps when you email to sign up, you'll save 25% off the total cost. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.